welcome all. We're going to talk about the integrity of carbon markets. I'm joined here by Maureen Mageras from Vertree Partners, Giulia Carbone from the, help me again, the World Climate Business, yeah.
World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And
That's
you're also a member, by the way.
Yeah. That's very true. That's very true. Not anymore. And Alexis Moyer from Space Intelligence. And yeah, we want to talk about the integrity of carbon markets. And my name is Daniel. I'm part of Rabobank. I'm the global head of a program called Trees for Farmers, where we plant trees on marginal farmland at farmers. So yeah, integrity of carbon markets. I think it's a pretty hot topic. We've all seen some recent news articles lately, also covering the topic. Maybe Giulia, starting with you, what is integrity of carbon markets? What does it mean to you from your perspective?
Yeah, thank you very much. So just to repeat, I'm Giulia from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and I'm also the director of the Natural Climate Solution Alliance that brings together companies, NGOs, and solution providers that are committed to catalyze demand for natural climate solution carbon credits. So we are really at the center of this conversation about integrity, because as you know, a lot of, there are attacks on both on the demand and supply side. So how are the credits developed, supply, and how are the credits used, demand? But I interpret your question more focusing, well, maybe on both. I can answer on both. So first of all, well, I'm also a board member of ICVCM, so the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. So I've been sitting in very, very long meetings for many times a week to discuss the details of the core carbon principles and the assessment framework. And that to me was clear that, integrity is not a mathematical formula, it's like a societal agreement of what we believe is will deliver on a certain promise. The promise is 1 ton of carbon, and then as a society, let's say a smaller group of society, but we discuss about what is good enough for us, right? How much do we want to ask the project developer to demonstrate that that ton of carbon really is delivered? And then you have to obviously break that down into the specific criteria, principles and criteria, because you say, okay, deliver in which way, right? So we talked about issues like additionality, about permanence, leakage, and then you define it again as people, right? There is not a mathematical formula that is invincible. That's our version of what is high integrity. Is not perfect, but we feel like is a kind of like a benchmark that could help all programs, carbon crediting programs, and methodology to be kind of benchmarked and create that kind of common level playing field to understand what good looks like. I like one of the comments that was made by one of the project developers that we also work with regularly, that they said, these standards have to be the minimum. The methodology should deliver is what they should, a project should deliver as a minimum. Then there is much more. And so this is my other message about integrity, especially to buyers, is you should definitely check that the project has been verified according to a methodology and, owned by a program that in the future is ICVCM accredited. But also there is always a space, a role to play by a due diligence that is tailored also to what the company's aspirations are, to be able to say, you meet my criteria. A company will always have a process to know your client. I mean, this is exactly the same. You're purchasing an asset that is really going to be part of, the company aspirations. So it's the due diligence important. One more point about integrity from the demand side. Also integrity, but a different story in terms of what, as a society, we believe is the role of carbon credits into the journey to net zero. So right now, there is an SBTi standard that calls for the use of credits as addition to the abatement measures that a company must take to stay on track to their net zero. Once the company gets to net zero, they have to invest in permanent removals. So SBTI does promote the investment in what they call beyond value chain actions, which effectively are carbon credits because they're always, beyond value chain. But we know that if you're looking at SBTI, at the moment, it doesn't allow the use of these credits against your targets. Just want to make a pitch. You have probably seen the call of the evidence that has been issued by SBTI last week. Is an opportunity for everybody to comment on also on how this market instrument could eventually be used also in value chain. Last part, other processes are ongoing to define claims, right? Because a claim is potentially something that a company can put a value on it, right? Could say, if I make this claim, I could gain this percentage of the market share, so investing in these credits could make sense. So I'm just wanted to, say that in the end, integrity is important, but the other very important element that the way we design integrity also has to make business sense, because otherwise we're talking about market without a buyer. So that's it.
Yeah, that's a great comment. Thank you, Giulia. And Maureen, over to you. I already said I think we've all read some news articles also in recent weeks, months. Why do you think it's important that we, talk about integrity now?
Yes, thank you. So just to recap as well, Muireann Mageras, I work for Vertree, which is the carbon business of Hartree Partners, an energy and commodities trading firm. So we directly finance, develop, commercialize, and sell environmental commodities, namely carbon credits, and make project-based investments. So, we've spent a lot of time thinking about and grappling with this concept of integrity, and also the way the market has evolved over the past year, and the questions that a lot of corporate buyers in particular are asking about participating in a market that is nascent and has increasingly come under scrutiny, oftentimes ill-deserved. And I think I'm probably preaching to the choir, but to go back to the basics for just a moment, most of us are in this room today because we probably recognize that nature is fundamental to the Paris Agreement goals. There is no known scenario that's viable to 2 degrees or 1.5 degree that doesn't include, the conservation of natural world ecosystems. As we've acknowledged in some of the sessions this morning, we sort of exist in a financial system that doesn't always quantify that and doesn't always correct that externality of climate change and the fact that you can produce emissions and not pay for that and not pay for the repercussions on our societies. So ultimately, this market exists to try to correct that, and nature is a critical component of that. And even more fundamental, if you look at the economics and want to get really precise about it, in many different scenarios of project constructs, nature-based solutions are dollar per ton of carbon avoided or removed, actually the most cost-effective solution, right? So that's also critical in a world that is very fixated on economics and financial incentives to come back to that core point, especially at a moment in time where a lot of the market has started to go off nature, again, because of so much of that noise that we're seeing and hearing. Now, of course, when you come back to the point of integrity, humans aren't really perfectly rational or efficient. So we can talk about economics, but I think you really see that reflected in the moment and the inflection point of the market today, where we are starting to risk, not making enough investment into nature, not making enough investment into these solutions. And this is where integrity comes back, because I fear we're at a moment that integrity is starting to be used as a linchpin, right? It's starting to be used almost as an excuse for inaction at a moment in time where most of us, in the corporate sustainability or CSR or ESG worlds, know that we need to move probably faster than ever. So I think it's really important that we acknowledge how far the carbon markets have actually come in terms of integrity, and this year was pivotal, right? You had the ICVCM producing the CCPs and the assessment framework. You've had incredible methodological overhauls of some of the main standards and their methodologies around nature and forestry and nature-based solutions. We also, candidly, have, going on 20 years of experience in these markets, designing these projects back from the Kyoto Protocol days, where we sort of know the fundamentals of what is quality, right? You know that your project should be registered. You know that your project needs to be additional and avoid leakage and be permanent, right? So I'm going to be somewhat controversial and really speaking to, I think, a lot of the audience in the room today. I think the best thing we can do if we're serious about a lot of these goals that we say we are is to try to move that discussion beyond worrying about integrity and actually celebrating kind of how far we've come on that integrity front and acknowledging that when it comes to nature, the science is imperfect. We have technological advancements, right? A lot of us are investing in them. Counterfactuals for any scientific methodology that's nature-based, it's always going to be easy to go back in time and say, oh, that wasn't perfect, but that's the nature of a counterfactual. So I think we would be better served to help the market understand that integrity means something in this context specifically. It will not be perfect. And how can we kind of move on and enable the market to do what it's meant to be doing, especially in a voluntary context?
Yeah, thanks, Maureen. And you also mentioned maybe changing the paradigm from worrying about integrity to more celebrating the achievements we already made. What would be one achievement or one development, like compared to the carbon market 10 years ago, that you think has already been a great step forward?
I mean, look, I think the mere existence of the voluntary carbon market in its current iteration and form, if we take a step back, is a pretty big achievement in and of itself, right? Because like I was saying, in a voluntary context, you have to come back to the definition of that word. In compliance markets, it's really easy to understand integrity because the parameters or the project type or what you're allowed to do or not to do are defined for you. In the voluntary world, not only are you choosing to do this, but we don't have a clear set of regulated parameters that say you can do X, Y, Z, right? So I think the fact that this market came back, had a resurgence, has seen the level of investment, even though it is not adequate for where we want to be, right, is an achievement in and of itself. And the fact that it's trying to self-regulate, right, that we put effort and time across as an industry into things like the ICVCM and VCMI, that we're doing consultations, you know, I think that shows a really big piece of momentum that definitely did not exist even 5 years ago or 10 years ago when I entered the market. And it should be acknowledged, right? But we also have to acknowledge the limitations there as well and understand that in that voluntary context, you know, there are more risks. And that's where I think the pieces of weaving this into broader brand value or corporate strategy, narratives, how can you really understand and quantify the co-benefits, right? How can you integrate so it's not just seen as a cost or a potential downside if you get attacked by a certain stakeholder, there's actually all these benefits. And I know those are often very, very hard to meaningfully quantify in a corporate context, and I've been there, but I think we need to try to be exploring those solution sets, you know, a lot more.
Yeah, clear, thanks. And yeah, back to you, Giulia. So you also mentioned the developments that we see on the core carbon principles, SBTI, etc. If you look ahead on the development there, what do you think is the main challenge on integrity for the coming years?
So challenge or opportunity, I think, is how do we bring together from a corporate perspective the commitments or, let's say, corporate obligation from climate and nature and people together. And I think and this is where I love nature-based solutions, because they're really about intervening with nature to address a societal challenge and bringing biodiversity and social, really elevating them as part of the solution, so really creating gains and opportunities. So I think the challenge and opportunity is how a company can start thinking in an integrated way. They have SBTI, then they have SBTN. Very soon there will be some SB for equity. Well, you know, how can we start pushing these elements together and really looking at solutions that are integrated? And this is also why, you know, with our work, yes, it's voluntary carbon market, but one of the, most of my day really focuses on biodiversity and people, trying to help companies really understand the role that biodiversity and people are playing. And actually one of the things we say, you know, let's stop calling them co-benefit. There are actually core benefits. They are a pillar of the solution, and the climate mitigation outcomes are the co-benefits. And so a change in narrative. So that is the challenge, I think, for tomorrow, to really see as an integrated way as companies can put, you know, address their own footprint in the three main imperatives, but also how they spend money beyond and, you know, above and beyond their targets into solutions that are really delivering more than just one in one domain.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, we look at the more holistic solution, not only on the carbon side of things, but also, you know, local communities and biodiversity. And where I think we are, whereas I think we all agree that that's a good development, there are, and a great opportunity, there might be some challenges also on a monitoring side of things, right? Because I think we now know that, we can monitor forest pretty well. But how do you, for example, monitor social impact or biodiversity impact? Alexis, what is what's your view on that?
Yeah, thanks. I'm Alexis. Just to introduce myself, I'm from a company called Space Intelligence. We're a nature tech company that uses satellite data alongside AI and our ecological expertise to help both project developers develop nature-based solutions projects by providing baseline information, but also working with large corporates like Apple and Shell to help them de-risk their investments into the nature-based solution space. In terms of monitoring, particularly you mentioned forestry, we've already got a good handle on monitoring deforestation and forest degradation from space. On the biodiversity side, it's a bit more difficult using satellite data, but there's a lot of other technologies out there, eDNA, ecoacoustics, that can be scaled up across larger project sites at landscape level using satellite data, for example. So if you have an ecosystem that you know you have a certain species in that's thriving, you can compare that to the condition of the ecosystem, and then where that condition exists elsewhere, you can make some assumptions about those species might also be present there. So it's a bit of proxy work, but there are ways to use satellite remote sensing to look at things like biodiversity.
Yeah, and so you just already mentioned AI, for example. What do you think will be key enablers in the coming years to become even more accurate in measuring impact on a biodiversity side or a social impact side?
I think the use of artificial intelligence is thrown around quite a lot. That was one of the buzzwords at New York Climate Week a few weeks ago as well. Lots of sessions on how that technology can be used. I think it's hard with biodiversity and social impacts because you do need that on the ground component. Everything can't be done remotely. You need to have people on the ground doing stakeholder interviews. You need to have people on the ground taking soil samples, taking biodiversity samples, for example. So it is harder to scale up. So I think that is one of the components that is more difficult. But we don't want to get away from that because those are also the components that support the local communities who are doing that work on the ground. And we want to not remove that from them. So I think that is one of the challenges of using more remote technologies and artificial intelligence, is that you then start to take away jobs from the local communities.
Clear. So yeah, I think these were great perspectives on sort of the importance, what integrity consists of, and the next steps. But I'm also really curious about the opinion from the audience here. I already see you already have a question there. Do we have someone with a mic who can come over? Otherwise, I just come over to you already. Can you introduce?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nicola Sineva. I represent Tree Valuation. We do develop carbon insetting programs and projects for companies with agricultural supply chains. And I would like to get your views on what is it that insetting can learn from offsetting? So what companies who want to decarbonize their agriculture value chains can learn from the storm we're experiencing with offsetting, because we start to hear the same for insetting, and we know that the accounting is not perfect. But what is it that we can actually take away from the great work which has been done up till now? Thank you.
Okay, I'll take part of it. I don't know. But certainly what is interesting, for example, in our coalition is that a lot of many of the organizations that work on the voluntary carbon market, they also work for the insetting, project. So effectively it's more an issue of accounting. It's not an issue of quality. The quality should be the same. The question is, how is accounted for? So it is a problem, the accounting, and hopefully the greenhouse gas protocol will address it. And I think addressing it, meaning we incentivize more finance towards also in value chain measures looking at natural climate solutions. So, but if there is something to learn is that there is no perfection, and it will be really important, however, to also, have the same level of quality applied to a project that is for the in value chain, because effectively it's still an intervention that looks at, nature and people. So that would be the recommendation.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll see a question here. We do have a mic now.
Hi, I'm Ed Asali from Zulu Ecosystems. The question for Giulia. There's a lot of emphasis today on the quality of projects, the integrity of projects. It's very supply side focused. But a lot of the criticism is actually about bad behavior from corporates who are using projects to cover up the fact that they're not actually applying the mitigation hierarchy. They're not trying hard enough to actually invest in mitigating their own and decarbonizing their own supply chains. Should we be actually stop talking about the quality of supply and actually focus more on the accounting standards and actually how corporates measure their own impact? Because I just worry that in a sense we keep beating the integrity issue on supply side, but actually it's a different problem that we really face.
I agree. Unfortunately, I wish we could find a way to stop the criticism on the supply side, because we are all suffering from that. Even, we work on the demand, but it's really breaking our hearts as well to see especially all the, forest protection projects, community being suffering really because they see their financing stream, their new economic model being completely destroyed. On the demand side, I don't have the numbers on top of my head, but I can tell you there is the Trove research, and next week they're going to launch another research from the ecosystem marketplace that, through their numbers and their research, they demonstrate that in general, like every research, there is always outliers, but in general, companies that actually purchase credits are also companies that do better in decarbonization. So this is actually a very important point also to put forward to our colleagues in SBTI, which do not include carbon credits, so beyond value chain actions as part of their delivery of the targets, because possibly there was this idea that this will distract from internal abatement. So I think right now as a society we have to decide, do we want to be just focus on internal abatement and accept that there are going to be huge limitation for let's say the hard to abate sectors? Or a colleague of mine, a company that we work often with, who's from a hard to abate, he said maybe we should stop talking about hard to abate sector, but talk about the easy to abate sectors, because there is a big. So it's not that for them there are a lot of sectors for which is complicated, and we know the story of Scope 3. So this is, I think, a very important conversation to have at the societal level. Say, what do we agree as a society that is acceptable? And then the big difference is, do we want to address the problem at the corporate level, so individual businesses achieve their net zero, or as a society, the global net zero? Because the two are not the same. The sum of the individuals achieving their corporate net zero will not necessarily take us to the global net zero. So I think and it's not an easy discussion to have, because there are models, different assumptions, but the clock is ticking, and that's something that we need to discuss very soon.
Thanks. Here we also have a question here.
Hi, my name is Jos Lemmens. I'm a consultant, by the way. Same topic. Oh, I should try. Same topic as the gentleman asked about, but a bit more direct. So how does that work, this client due diligence? Right? When do you say to a company, nah, I don't want your money? How does that work currently? How does it work? Because there's no general standard or anything, right? How do you cope with that?
It's a very good question. Look, the honest and fair answer is there's no one-size-fits-all approach. And I'd like to think that all of us are operating in good faith in this market and not saying, oh, I'll take your money or I'll throw your money away. But it's more nuanced than that. It's, at least the way we approach it is, for every client or everyone who's exploring using environmental markets, it's getting to the core of why, right? Are you doing this to achieve, the goals of a certain set of stakeholders, internally or external, be they shareholders, customers, investors? Are you doing this because you foresee a regulatory regime coming down the road, or exposure, right? Your governments have asked you to do this. You're positioning yourself as a sort of national champion to get ready for global carbon markets. Are you doing this purely because your CEO woke up one day and said, you know what, I want to leave a better legacy and here's a budget to do it, right? These are all real situations and scenarios that we've seen in the market and that exist. And again, when there's no kind of standard set of supply or demand, you can't have a standard set of solutions. So I think the key to success in this market is understanding why the buyer is looking to buy what they buy and why they're asking you for the advice or asking you for your product, and then fitting the pieces of the puzzle in from there. And again, come back to acknowledging the limitations, right? Especially in a voluntary context, you don't have black and white guidance on what's the perfect credit, what's the perfect type of claim, how can I make this bulletproof? So, the way at least we have dealt with that is just being very transparent and mitigating as much risk as we can, both from a product and a financial perspective, but also from a narrative perspective. And I've actually seen corporates have really great success with being a little more open and transparent about the journeys that they're on and applying things like innovation theory and test and learn to these markets or to these approaches to corporate sustainability and saying, okay, maybe I'm just going to procure a couple thousand tons, see how this goes, test it with some stakeholders. Oh, it's going well. Great. Now I can integrate this into my broader net zero strategy, and now I can scale up over time. It's often not as black and white as I think we make it out to be, and therefore not as scary. But that's, it's getting into the level of detail on those conversations that I find really unlocks the potential. No.
Thanks for that, Muireann. Yeah, we had a question over there as well.
Hi there. Yeah, my name's Charlie Roper-Ord. I'm the head of natural capital at Tree Economy. Just following on from the demand side conversations, I've kind of lost count of the number of times I've had conversations with either investors or buyers who start off by telling me they only invest in high quality projects until I tell them the price, and then they walk away from it and say, no, that's far too much. I only want to pay 12. What can be done to, I suppose, educate the buy side about how much these projects really cost if you really want to have the fundamental benefits that we're talking about?
I'm happy to give it a first shot. So first of all, as the NCS Alliance, we did some work last year on due diligence. And when we got to the step about, define your budget and define the volume, right? We had a really intense discussion internally saying, what should we say? Maximize volume, maximum value. And we ended saying our recommendation is maximize value. So even if this will require buying a bit less, if you have a defined budget, of course, ideally is buy as much, to counterbalance your remaining emissions. But let's say, in a way, it answers your question. Is not maximizing, buy the cheapest one and buy as much as possible. Is prioritize the value of the project, i.e., of the credit. And therefore, we do recognize that good projects are going to be more expensive. We haven't yet gone into the detail of saying, what are the main, elements that build the price. Also because there are a lot of information that is very difficult to extract. But one thing we are doing now is to create also for buyers more clarity about how the origination of a project, of a credit happens. So therefore, all the different steps on the journey for this credit to be issued, right? And I was just reading the draft yesterday. It's so rich. There is so much knowledge, so much experience, so much work, so much sweat that I hope those who are going to read it, they will understand, well, my God, this is definitely worth some money, because you can't, something that goes through all these steps and everything must be worth something. So we hope to do our part. We definitely work a lot with businesses promoting, saying, yes, it's worth the premium. But, happy to discuss other ideas.
Thanks for that. Are there any other questions for now? Yeah, otherwise I do have a question. So from a very practical standpoint, when we started, with our pilots in Brazil a couple of years ago, we also thought, okay, what is, a good quality credit? And on the one hand, the farmers immediately said, oh yeah, let's plant eucalyptus because it grows twice as fast. So we have 2 times more carbon and it's half the cost, and then, yeah, in the end we went with a native forest scenario. But I think, there is always, impact, social impact, biodiversity impact, and carbon impact often go hand in hand, but sometimes there is a bit of conflict in there. Do you have any additional views on that, Giulia or Muireann?
Yeah, I'm happy to start here, but would love to hear from all the panelists on this one. again, I think it comes back to what's the problem you're trying to solve, right? And unfortunately, the reality of the world we live in is that we sometimes have to optimize, right? So again, I think there's very few situations where you're going to find the perfect project or the perfect investment. But you can find some where you say, okay, maybe the carbon value is less, but I'm ensuring this biodiversity, and this land is really critical in my supply chain for this reason, and therefore, holistically, this makes sense, right? Or okay, maybe the IRR on this is slightly lower, but I know it's achieving this other strategic goal. I think we have to show a little more flexibility in terms of understanding the trade-offs of when you look at different parameters associated with these project investments. And again, you can't ignore the biodiversity in favor of the carbon. And you certainly cannot ignore the social benefits or even, the social responsibilities if you want to implement nature-based projects in many parts of the world, right? So I think we also have to be very honest with ourselves about what those numbers are, the trade-offs associated with them, and then matching that with the right demand, right? Because coming back to my point before, different types of buyers are going to have different priorities. And, that's kind of, again, one of the roles that we try to serve is matching that supply and demand in a way that's most fit for purpose, especially in a market where, again, we don't have a lot of rules.
Yeah, and I like to connect this question to the question about, the price, because effectively you could reach the same result at the project level by selling less credits, but at a higher value, because they also have really generated gains for biodiversity. You could say, well, they might generate the same benefit for society, but I think it's not just about the revenue, it's also, becoming steward of the land. I mean, there are a lot of a lot of projects that we have interacted with where they said, the first answer was exactly, let's stick to our traditional way, but the project is about changing ways. I mean, a lot of these projects, especially the projects that are about protecting forests, are about changing the way communities interact and the type of value they put on natural resources. So that is actually the project. What you have done is actually the project, helping communities see a different way, right? And helping them also get the maximum benefits, but from a different economic model. And when you hear the project developers and the community say, the project is about changing our economic model. This is it, right? We can talk about the methodologies called RED, the other methodologies are forestation, but effectively is to change the economic model from being, exploiting nature to become steward of nature and having a model where other countries, other businesses actually pay for that.
Great, thank you. I saw a question over there. I'll walk towards you.
Thank you. I'm Ray. I work for an energy company in the hard-to-abate sector, obviously. So I work as a climate SME within the team. So I understand this landscape to some extent, definitely not to the extent that you all have expertise in. I was recently talking to my director, who is newly imbibed this job, and he has come from the energy sector. So I was trying to convince him to, why should we invest in high-quality credits? And his question to me was, Ray, if I'm getting something at $4, financially, why would I pay something $100 for the same thing? So how do you explain someone who doesn't know that language, who doesn't speak it, from a financial standpoint, from a stakeholder standpoint, that why is it important? Thank you.
Absolutely. The point is, we need to help you demonstrate to your boss that is not the same thing. And so that's where I think there has to be much more coordination between project developers, those who are the intermediaries, and the NGOs that are on the ground to make the case that is not just the 1 ton of carbon. And I know often we have this conversation, is a commodity or not? I'm on the campus, is not a commodity, but there is the camp that we can debate this, but even if it's something about asking more than just 1 ton of carbon, which is already has these issues because we know that not, even the 1 ton of carbon is not always delivered, but there is much more. So I think we need to become much better in demonstrating what is this more, right? And being able to quantify and also help companies be able to, and I put in quotes, claim it, be able to communicate and show that we did more than just a ton of carbon is, benefit in this case, different type of benefits, because it will make a big difference.
Heath? There's a microphone behind you. Yeah.
Hi, thanks a lot to the panel for a really interesting discussion. I'm Keith from Plan Vivo. I was particularly encouraged to hear a talk about integrity, not just on carbon integrity, which of course is really important, but those so-called co-benefits. And I wanted to pick up on Giulia's point about setting a minimum standard, because for us at Plan Vivo and for a lot of other organizations, having that benefit sharing, equitable, fair and equitable benefit sharing for communities, where communities are really actively involved, encouraged and incentivized, is a minimum standard. And it's often missed out on a talk or discussions around integrity. So I'd be keen to hear what the panel think about that.
Yeah, look, I mean, again, I think the more that we can put standards and guardrails and, you know, regulation or quasi-regulation on this market and on the different pieces of it and the products and types of projects, the better off everyone will be. And, you know, there are a lot of different theories around voluntary versus compliance markets, the convergence of them. But if you always come back to that fundamental point, you know, the more clarity and guidance you have, the better. And I think especially, again, coming back to nature-based projects and the fact that there are local communities involved and the benefit sharing is so critical. Yes, it goes without saying that there needs to be guidance and guardrails, and minimum standards would be fantastic, conceptually speaking. I think we also, and I'm going to be slightly controversial here, but we also need to be really realistic about the process by which we can get those in place, right? And I think the VCM has done a phenomenal job, again, of through your work, of everyone's work here, you know, through standards, through engagement, through alliances, through these conferences, creating a consensus about what that should look like, even if we can't enforce it and can't all be quite on the same page. But I can't help but think that fundamentally, and especially to the corporate audience in this room, the way we enable this to actually be standardized and fair, and the way we enable demand so that we can actually start generating more financial flows, is by increasing those guardrails. And I think there's a piece of sort of working with governments and regulators and lobbying in a way to actually ask for the rules of the road. There's precedent for this in pretty much every other market we can think of, right? A lot of them started off a bit chaotic like this, and it was actually the big corporates and the big players who went to their governments and went to their regulators and said, hey, you need to help us because navigating it this way is causing more harm than good. So, you know, I think we'd be remiss to not acknowledge that dynamic as well and weave that into all of your carbon and sort of biodiversity strategies. Is there's also a bit of responsibility here to say, okay, we can only go so far. Here's what we actually need to take it to the next step.
I totally agree with you.
Great. We do have time, I think, for one more question. Is there any final question for the audience? No? If not, then I propose that we conclude this session. So thank you very much. Oh, wait, we do have one more question there. Yeah.
Sorry, latecomer with questions. Steve Edwards, newly with South Pole. Any initial reflections regarding the emerging biodiversity markets and crediting schemes and lessons that we can learn from these integrity concerns for the carbon market? Thank you.
Look, I'm going to disclaim this, that I do not spend very much time on the biodiversity credit market, and I'm not an expert, so we'll again defer to others in the room. But the one thing I will say here is let's definitely look at what's happened in carbon markets and try to avoid some of the pitfalls, right? So is there a way that we can leapfrog ahead to, again, clearer guidelines, regulation? Can we get on the same page? Can we maybe define these products or these credits a bit more clearly from the get-go? Maybe focus more, again, somewhat controversial. I think one of the biggest pitfalls of the VCM the past few years has been the fact that we all got really excited because we're motivated by the fact that you're merging kind of market and fundamental economics with the biggest challenge of our time and being able to do something good as a career. And we jumped straight to setting up a lot of infrastructure without focusing on the fundamentals of supply and demand, right? Let's not do that again in a biodiversity market. Let's focus on those fundamentals of what is the supply, what is the demand, how do we define the two, and then put the structures in place around how do you structure that, how do you finance it, how do you trade it, procure it. I think that's one really obvious example. And again, I'd say let's not get ahead of ourselves, right? Let's focus on tactically addressing the existing issues we have in the existing markets today, and then add on layers of complexity and new product types and new investment types on top. Might not be, as popular an opinion, but I think, you know, we need to sort of streamline and simplify things at this point in time instead of overcomplicating them.
I totally agree again. Definitely working on the demand, because we are talking about a biodiversity market and you wonder where is the demand. So I think that's something, you know, collaborating with those who actually set targets, you know, set regulation to see where can we create that space for a business to actually purchase these credits, in addition to addressing their own footprint, right? Because again, here we are talking about actions in addition to addressing their own area, you know, their own responsibilities. But in addition to your comments, I would say also, let's make sure that this doesn't become an either or, right? It's the voluntary carbon market and voluntary biodiversity market, depending on the, you know, the flavor of the day or the shiny object or whatever other ways we have to define this. Because we know that, especially in the voluntary carbon market for natural climate solutions, so we're effectively talking about the same type of interventions: nature protection, improved management, restoration, but to be quantified in different ways. And I think, you know, there are going to be places that have more potential for carbon. Therefore, probably selling them through the carbon market might be more viable. Other places might have more potential for nature. You know, we have, you know, key biodiversity areas that are so important for biodiversity that they really have this, astounding potential biodiversity gains. So I would imagine them seeing on the continuum rather than either or, because otherwise we're going to start having, you know, the pot of money, which we want to expand, because we should really try to expand this pot of money, but there is a limit. So we have also to see where is, in what we want is to invest more in nature and not creating conflicts.
I can add something to that from the measurement perspective in terms of biodiversity. One of the things that we've been seeing a lot with our conversations with individuals is that people are confused. How do I measure biodiversity? They're looking for one metric, one thing to measure to say, I've increased biodiversity by X% across my site. But we need to lose that focus. It's different to the carbon market, where you're looking at reducing carbon by a carbon unit. There can be multiple ways to measure biodiversity, multiple impacts you can have on biodiversity. And I know Plan Vivo is doing great work in this with their biodiversity credit basketing method, for example, looking at multiple ways to measure and uplift biodiversity. So lose the tunnel focus on one metric only for the biodiversity credit market.
Great, thanks a lot. So thanks again to the audience, and also thanks to Maureen, Giulia, and Alexis. Yeah, thank you.